great and unexpected honor. My time here really has been, as far as I've been concerned, a great game with Professor Zaleski and Professor Biela to come over many years to see these changes in this university and in Poland, and to some extent, I hope, to have contributed something to people who participate in these discussions with the students. And I was very interested yesterday to meet, I think, the Vice Dean, who turns out to have been one of the students I met in the course of my second visit when Professor Zaleski and Professor Biela were both away, and I came, and apparently she was one of the students at that time, and she tells me yesterday that this was a very interesting discussion we had. So I've been coming here since 1987, and as I think somebody already said, originally I was invited by Anna Ciganowicz to the Polish Psychological Association at their meeting in Cieszyn at that time, and I was not going to say anything about this progressive matrices test, but it appears in all the posters, and Adam Biela has been talking about it, and everybody has been talking about it, so I feel I need to say a little bit about this test. I'm not sure how many people in this room actually know this Raven progressive matrices test. Could you put up your hands? Okay, some at the back. Okay, this test was developed for research purposes. It was not developed as a practical test for use in practical situations. My father was engaged in research into the genetic and the environmental origins of mental defect. And in order to do that, in this area of England, he had to go and test all the children and the parents of every family in which there was a child who had been diagnosed as having some kind of mental deficiency. And he found that the tests that he was supposed to use, which was the Stanford Binet intelligence test, was very cumbersome to administer in homes where there were all sorts of children clambering all over the place, in schools where there was no peace and quiet, in workplaces where there was all sorts of machinery and so on, and the situations where everybody wanted to help the disabled child to deal with the problems and so on. So the test was cumbersome to administer, and the results were difficult to interpret because all sorts of different scores were composited together into this kind of hodgepodge test score, an arbitrary score based on adding up scores on a variety of different things. And to actually interpret this in theoretical terms was virtually impossible. More recently, people have reduced this essentially to 2 factors or something or other, but he was a student of Charles Spearman. Now, Spearman had looked at the correlations between different tests in schools and found that they formed always positive correlations. People who were good at one thing tended to be good at the other. Some of the correlations were quite high, like 0.8, that's to say 60% of the variance. Some were very low, 0.1, 0.2, a small proportion of variance, but they all had a common element, which Spearman very carefully distinguished from the term intelligence, because this word intelligence is used in 150 different ways to mean all sorts of different things. So Spearman called this G, a general statistical factor, equivalent to the kinds of terms used in physics and so on, G in physics and so on. Okay. He then showed from different kinds of studies that this G was made up of two very different abilities that work closely together. One was this, what he called eductive ability, the ability to draw meaning out of complex information, to make meaning. It's a measure of meaning-making ability, the ability to make meaning out of new situations, and the ability to reproduce information that had been made explicit before. So he produced these, he developed a set of criteria for what a test that would be useful in these theoretical studies, to study the background, to genetic and environmental background to these kinds of abilities. And as I say, he developed a schema that said it should be simple to use, it should be non-verbal, would not need to be have questions read out verbally, read to people to remember, this kind of thing. And my mother and he were playing this game known as noughts and crosses in the UK, or in America, tic-tac-toe, where you have what is essentially a 3x3 matrix in which you put noughts and crosses and try and get a line of crosses or zeros across this matrix. And then they thought, okay, they would make this game more complicated. And it was snowing outside, so they decided to put snowflakes in these squares of this 3x3 matrix. And the idea was to make the snowflakes change in character in a systematic way and see who could complete this 3x3 matrix of snowflake designs. So this is the origin of this test. It was developed for research purposes. It was not developed for practical use. It was theoretically based, and it was designed to be used in many situations. Now, one has to say, Adam Biela, I think, has already said quite a lot, but the field of abilities, and thinking about abilities, is huge. And most of it is a mess, with very poorly conceptualized concepts and methods. One small part of this is concerned with so-called intelligence, and most of that is a mess. And down in the bottom corner, you have this little bit concerned with these two abilities, reproductive, eductive and reductive ability. These are not factors. These are two very different abilities that work closely together. One is not a crystallized form of the other. They have the different genetic origins and so on. But, as I've forgotten, somebody said, this test was born in the same year as I was. The war came along, and the military then thought, a test that is not related to different dialects of people from different parts of the country. It can be administered in a short period of time. It predicts important things like the ability to understand how equipment works and so on. So it was rapidly taken up, first of all in Great Britain and then the Allies, and spread all over Europe very quickly into the armed services, the educational services. It spread all over the Soviet Union, despite Stalin saying that we don't have psychologists and so on. It was used all over the Soviet Union, and it was used in the Soviet Union's educational system. It spread all around the world, in Brazil, in Singapore, and so on. And I was once I was in Singapore, talking to whoever was dealing with the test there, and she said, this test is used everywhere, by everyone, for everything. And she went on to say, that it was administered to 5-year-old children entering school, 7-year-old as they transitioned to the major part of primary schools, at 11-year-old as they transitioned from elementary school to secondary school, at 15 to higher education, and then selection for occupations. So you've got this enormous application worldwide. So this test that was developed for research purposes, precisely because it was theoretically based and designed to be used in these research studies, had this enormous practical implications. And we tried to calculate how many people worldwide have had their lives altered by this test over the 80 years that it's been around. And one has to say that it's hundreds of thousands, if not billions, of people whose lives have been affected by this moving into their lives, this theoretically based test. And one has to say that, I think Adam, to a degree, said, this field of abilities has been telescoped down to virtually the only abilities that people really assess and talk about, these two little bits of the picture. So you've got evaluations of people that miss out any statement about their different abilities. You've got evaluations of educational programs that miss out most of the talents of the students and fail to nurture them. So Spearman wrote that neither tests of G nor the tests used in schools, that is to say, tests of reading, writing, and mathematics, had any place in schools because they prevented teachers, parents, politicians thinking about the process of drawing out the vast variety of talents and abilities. So you've got a situation where everything, these other abilities, are more or less rendered invisible by the concentration on these two little bits of the picture. So, I didn't mean to talk about that, it was just that I originally got here because the Polish Psychological Society invited me to talk to the association about this, and Adam and everybody has put it in this poster that's all over the place. I have no intention of talking about this. I did mean to say that, okay, I kind of expected a different balance of people in this audience, but over the years, the situation here has changed, and I used to ask people, you know, what did they think of this change from this time of so-called communism to this time of so-called free market? And I used to get an answer. But now nobody has any idea of this previous time. So I wanted to mention that when we were in Cheskin, we were waiting for a bus to get back to the railway station, to get the train back to Warsaw. And the little car came along and it jumped its wheels onto the sidewalk, and out jumped a very young guy who turned out to be Professor Zaleski, and got into a conversation with Anna Cikanovic, and he said, send him to Lublin. So Anna said, oh, how is he going to get to Lublin? And Zaleski answered, I will speak to the train driver. Now, this is a kind of different society, yeah? And not only did I come on the train, I don't remember whether I travelled with the train driver or not, but so we get here, and then, okay, I don't know what we did during the day, but then it comes to time to go to sleep or something, and then I don't know whether we went to the car or walked or something, but I remember this feeling of being smuggled into probably some kind of convent with nuns and so on, and found somewhere to sleep. And all of this was very strange to me and so on. But this is kind of a story about you know, how we got here and perhaps some kind of insight into the start of this process in this very different kind of society. Now, what am I supposed to be talking about? I'm supposed to be talking about something toward a sustainable society. And I don't think I actually need to say very much because Adam has already said a great deal. But when I came in 1987, some of the students were already interested in this environmental problem and so on. And they had kind of realized that, yeah, one could do something. You could not eat certain kinds of food, or you could not drive your car, or something like that. But all of these mini effects would have very little effect, because their effect would be washed out by wider forces in society. So you've got here an appreciation that this is a systems problem. It's a systems problem, not something that you can do much about individually, because the individual changes get washed out by the reactions of the rest of the system. And this, in fact, is represented in one of the most important laws of system science, which is Forester's law, that well-intended small interventions in complex systems always have counterintuitive and usually counterproductive results. So you have a situation in which well-intentioned politicians and one person or another tries to intervene in this complex system with something that looks as if it's a good idea, but the effect is counteracted by the reactions of the rest of the system. The problem then is to understand this overall system and how you could intervene in it, and what kind of governance system, what kind of ways of running society would enable one to deal with these problems. Now, the problems are actually much worse than students then and most people today appreciate. This became first clear when Bill Rees produced his study of how much the production of how much land would be required for the Fraser Valley of Canada to, is used by the Fraser Valley for the people who live there to live as they do. And the answer was 14 times all the produce from 14 times the area of land of that valley are required for that population to live there as they did then. Similarly, a little bit of the picture, Holland uses all the agricultural produce for an area of land 7 times its size just to feed its cattle. Now, if you add this ecological footprint up, you find that you need 3 to 5 backup planets engaged in nothing but agricultural activity and activities to absorb greenhouse gases and so on, for all the world to live as we live. So what this is saying is that these United Nations Sustainable Development Goals cannot be achieved. The other half of this picture is there are 2 fundamental laws of physics having to do with the conservation of energy and matter. If you take any kind of energy to transform any kind of substance, neither the energy nor the matter goes away. It shows up somewhere else. So if you take any kind of energy to transform anything into bits for motor cars, or heating for houses, or spaceflight, it doesn't go away. It shows up somewhere else, as space debris, as noxious gases, as plastic bottles in the oceans, as pesticides and fertilizers in the rivers and waterways, the destruction of the seas and the soils and the atmosphere. And this global warming is only one bit. One needs radical change in the way we live if we are to survive as a species. And I think Adam was quoting some previous, well, it was some pope, yes, right, in some encyclical saying exactly that. So, through what mechanism could one introduce that kind of change? Now, it cannot be done by central authorities, because the central authorities have so many things need to be done that they cannot possibly know everything that needs to be done. Cannot be centrally commanded. In fact, it can't even be envisaged. The change that is required is as great as a change from an agricultural society to an industrial society. And just as no one in an agricultural society could envisage what an industrial society would look like, so no one can envisage what a sustainable society in which we've got rid of our cars, our television sets, our current marketing processes, our international trading systems. These have all got to go. What does this alternative society look like? It cannot be envisaged. All one can do is try and set in train a network of social changes which will have some hope of creating some kind of society that will continue to survive into the future. Now, we got, I think the rector said, some kind of insight into this from studies of the educational system. Now, this educational system, 2/3 of the money spent on education are wasted so far as the development of human resources are concerned. This system destroys the lives of about 1/3 of the pupils. It is in need of radical change. But what you get is these central authorities saying, well, what we need is more testing in schools. And that occupies all the time of the teachers, so there's no time for teaching anymore, spend all the time testing, and this, by definition, because it's norm reference testing, by definition, defines 1/2 of the pupils as failures and 1/3 as serious failures. So instead of improving the quality of education, even in these narrow terms of learning this knowledge, this is a highly destructive, centralized intervention. I say even in terms of this knowledge, because knowledge-based education is a waste of time. Knowledge has a half-life of a year. People, students, forget 50% of what they knew after 1 year, 75% after 2 years, 82.5% after 3 years, and so on. Never entirely disappears. This knowledge is out of date when it's taught, is forgotten by the time it's needed, and doesn't relate to people's needs because they need to do all sorts of different things. So you need to move toward a competence-based educational system which picks up and nurtures all these other abilities that I was talking about earlier on. So we need to find ways of recognizing the huge diversity of human talents and how to nurture them, how to use them, how to enable them to form these emergent groups that create change in society. Okay, so if you want to do that, you've got to create a great deal of experimentation within the system to encourage different teachers, different teachers to experiment with different educational processes. You've got to mount comprehensive evaluations of each of those options. Now, a comprehensive evaluation means assessing all the intended and unintended, short-term and long-term, personal and social consequences of the activity. Is exactly counter to reductionist science, where you're taught in science to look at the relationship between one input and one outcome. The result is you get highly misleading evaluations. So a friend of mine has produced a meta-analysis of 500 800 meta-analysis of what works in education. And what works is defined solely in terms of scores on these knowledge-based tests. So this is entirely misleading information. It's the generation of scientific knowledge which is entirely corrupting the users of the system. Okay, so at this point you're challenging reductionist science, in which the image of science is to study one thing at a time and one outcome at a time, and neglect all the other outcomes. So in agriculture, for example, you get evaluations of fertilizers and pesticides that look at the effect on crop yields. No need to look at the effects on the birds and their impact on the food chain. No need to look at the destruction of the soils. You can increase your yields by putting out these fertilizers and pesticides. The science is reductionist science that looks at one thing at a time, instead of some kind of comprehensive science that looks at all the effects, short, long-term, of each intervention. And it's a radical change in ways of thinking about science. So here we have, I forgot what you're supposed to call rectors, Your Excellency or something. Here we have some kind of recommendation, which you can't implement because you're trapped by things like the Bergamot protocol, funding arrangements that say you only have money for these limited studies commissioned by government. What is important here is to change the image of science as taught in your university. It is to study the social processes that lead everybody to behave in ways that they can see are counterproductive. I think Adam mentioned socio-cybernetics. Cybernetics is the study of the hidden, invisible guidance and control processes that operate in animals and machines. You have to say animals, because otherwise people think only of machines. But when you say animals, looking at the internal guidance processes that control the operation of your body. And this is an organic system. How can you study this organic system? So when you apply this to society, and get socio-cybernetics, the study of the hidden, invisible social processes that control the way society operates, and then the invention of more organically oriented ways of managing society. I don't really have time to talk about more of that, so I'll just shut up at this point. But there's plenty of work for your university to do things that have not been done over the last 30 years or something. Thank you.